Well, look, one thing is certain. People are very, very angry about China. Yesterday, Josh Frydenberg announced pretty severe, immediate and indefinite restrictions on all foreign investment. So effective from 10:30pm Sunday night, the Treasurer has lowered to zero the dollar value of every foreign investment bid that will trigger scrutiny by the Foreign Investment Review Board and then ultimately by him. So as things stand, the Treasurer will have the final say. As I'm sure you know, there have been varying foreign investment thresholds depending on the buyer, the country in which the bids were based and the type of asset for sale. The thresholds ridiculously ranged from $1.1 billion to $275 million to zero, which was just a licence to come in and buy up Australia. As I've always said, it doesn't matter who runs the country if you don't own it. Well, now under the change, the threshold is zero for everything, meaning every foreign bid for anything will have to be weighed against the national interest. I wonder how this will happen. National interest hasn't counted for much in the past. Now, this crackdown was sparked after two Chinese-owned property developers, Greenland Australia and Risland Australia, had their staff secure more than 100 tonnes of surgical masks, thermometers, antibacterial wipes, hand sanitizer, gloves and Panadol in January and February, and shipped them back to China. Many Australians would argue the Foreign Investment Review Board has long demonstrated it is not up to the job of protecting the national interest. Pauline Hanson made this quite plain in a letter last week to the Prime Minister, in which she said, amongst other things, and I quote, "I will not allow foreign nations to fight over the carcass of Australia's misfortune." She said, "Australians will not forgive you, Prime Minister, if your government refuses to act on safeguarding this nation from international vultures." I should say that I put my interview with Pauline Hanson about China and a copy of her letter to the Prime Minister on my Facebook page, along with my comments, and in under 24 hours it was seen by more than 1.3 million people and there were over 6,000 comments. People are bloody angry. And as for the Foreign Investment Review Board, with one permanent employee and a handful of part-time members, there's little evidence that they give proper consideration to the sale of any Australian asset. Consider this. Between 2007 and 2017, the Foreign Investment Review Board reviewed almost 12,000 applications and rejected 5. Add to all this the fact that people are angry about the soft treatment dished out to China in relation to a lot of this predatory behaviour. When President Trump dared to call it the Wuhan virus or the China virus, he was treated as if it was Hitler or Idi Amin. But the Chinese communist regime is responsible for what we're going through today. The Chinese communist regime is entirely responsible for your business going broke and closing down, for your life's work being thrown into chaos and employees being thrown out of work. Our listeners and viewers are not stupid. One said, and I quote, "The Chinese communist regime is entirely responsible for all the coronavirus illness and all the coronavirus deaths. The Chinese communist regime is entirely responsible for your holidays being cancelled and the travel ban. The Chinese communist regime is entirely responsible for the possibility of flagship airlines going broke and tens of thousands of people ending up on the scrap heap of employment, for your school closures, your sporting fixtures being cancelled and the massive hit on the world stock market. And of course, the hit on your superannuation. The Chinese communist regime is entirely responsible for crashing the world economy. And given all of this, because of their fortress mindset and siege mentality, they're sensitive and offended about losing face and being shamed in the eyes of the world because their virus, in the tradition of naming viruses after the geographical place of origin, their virus bears the name of Chinese Wuhan virus. As Jim, a listener of mine, wrote, "The Chinese communist regime may well be able to intimidate and control the thinking and the speech of their own people, but they and the Western media lackeys cannot and will not be allowed to control the thinking and therefore the speech of the free world." Well, one person whose speech they won't control is George Christensen, the federal Liberal MP for the North Queensland seat of Dawson. George Christensen's 41 years of age. He's been a member of the House of Representatives since 2010, and he's angry on a range of fronts, and he's entitled to be. He joins Peter and me via Skype. George Christensen, thank you for your time. Firstly, the Foreign Investment Review Board, are you any more confident that the national interest will be protected?
Well, I've got to say, in past record, the Foreign Investment Review Board don't always come up with the right answers there. However, I am confident in Josh Frydenberg and in Scott Morrison in actually understanding what the public mood is and reflecting that in decisions. And the buck stops with them.
Is the Treasurer saying now that every application has to be approved by him?
Well, that's essentially what he's done with lowering that threshold to zero. It goes through the Foreign Investment Review Board processes, but ultimately he gets the call. And I think that Josh Frydenberg is well aware that the public sentiment is against letting particularly state-owned corporations out of China swoop in and pick up Australian companies, Australian farmland and all the rest of it for a song, which is what they could do. It's what actually is doing right now in other countries.
So are you confident that Canberra will have the spine to stop the rest of the world from collecting our cheapened assets?
I believe that that is why Josh Frydenberg has made this change. We cannot have Australian companies whose value has plummeted being sold out from under us for a song to China. They shouldn't be sold out from under us to China at all. And to that end, Alan, as you know, I'm the head of the Parliament's Trade and Investment Committee, and we've got an inquiry that we're going to get underway as soon as all these restrictions are gone, that's looking into the long-term implications of this and whether really we have too much foreign investment from state-owned corporations out of China.
Peter?
Well, I have to say, George, I'll hold my breath that something actually comes of this. You and I have been talking about this issue. I differentiate foreign investment from foreign control, which is a very different thing. But we've been talking about this issue, you and I, I'd probably go back 6 or 7 years when I worked in politics. It's all good and well if you've got someone you trust in there, like the Prime Minister and like Josh Frydenberg, but you've got to have laws or a regime that works for the worst case Treasurer, the Treasurer that's pro-Chinese, as Alan talked about, a Labor MP in New South Wales being pro-Chinese. You've got to have a regime that's robust, that stands up to scrutiny regardless of who and what side of politics is in the Treasurer's chair. It's really hard to define national interest. How are we going to be able to define national interest?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. This definition around national interest is really going to be tight. In my view, and I think in most of the public's mind as well, it's not the national interest to have state-owned corporations owning Australian companies, foreign state-owned corporations owning Australian farmland and agribusiness and strategic assets. It's also questionable whether it's in the national interest for foreign capital to simply swoop in and displace Australian capital. And so unless they're contributing something, unless there's going to be extra jobs, growth and new activity that's going to benefit the whole community, you've got to question whether that is in the national interest at all. And I think that that's what we're going to have to tighten up.
Well, see, George, has the rubber hit the road? I mean, are we going to have to revise all this stuff about free trade and tariffs? Are we going to stop selling off our industries and manufacturing and start investing in ourselves?
I think that this whole event and what's happened before it, what's happened after it with China, is going to ensure that there is a big rethink about how we do business with that country. And, I will be saying at the point where we're allowed back down there in Canberra in Parliament House that we desperately need to change the definition of national interest, set up a test for that, so that, as Peter says, if we've got the worst Treasurer in there, a pro-Chinese Treasurer, that he can't make those sort of decisions that sell out our
Absolutely. Peter's right. The reality is, sorry, Peter, I just make this point. The reality is this. Whether we like it or whether we don't, no one is opposed to investment. We're opposed to ownership. And the Chinese own our dairy farms, they own our beef farms, our coal, our water, the port of Darwin, for God's sake, our avocado farms, large tracts of the best grazing land in the country. And the public don't believe anything will change.
Okay, so put this disease through the prism of, imagine if it was a worldwide food shortage, a shortage of protein, let's say, a shortage of basic foodstuffs. China now owns so many dairy farms in this country and milk processors that it could basically take most of the milk out of Tasmania and certainly large parts of Victoria through its own processing plants on through its own ports and airport access and basically on planes back to China like they did with those masks only a couple of months ago. And no one in Australia would get a glass of milk that's created from farms in Australia because of the way in which they own and control that whole supply chain. I think the challenge for you, George, is to talk about foreign investment, in this case foreign control. When you talk about state-owned enterprises, we know the vast bulk of them are Chinese. And the moment you bravely speak up on this issue, you are decried as being a racist, as being anti-Chinese. This is a threshold I think Australians have to get past in order to have a really sober discussion about this. It's not so much China, it's not so much a foreign investment, it's an issue of a state-owned enterprise, authoritarian regime, and Australians basically being prisoners of their own economy.
That's absolutely right, Peter. I mean, food security is a huge issue when it comes to this. It's obviously food security is part of national security. And again, you're right. I mean, there isn't too many state-owned corporations in the world, but everyone knows when you say state-owned corporation, you're mainly talking about China.
Just before we go, George, Terry Barnes, writing yesterday in the Spectator this week, says this: as the world faces the Wuhan virus-induced recession, or worse, and people are dying in their thousands, why shouldn't Mr Morrison, President Trump and other world leaders calculate the damage that Chinese regime's negligence has wrought and send Comrade Xi the most gigantic reparation bill in the history of mankind? Wrote Terry Barnes, he deserves it, and his discredited despotic government should be made to pay for it. George, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely, they shouldn't be made to pay reparations. I don't think they will, but maybe we can take back some of the land that their foreign-owned corporations have as damages. You know, because either it's negligence or something worse. The University of Southampton's put out a report that says if they acted 3 weeks earlier, China acted 3 weeks earlier, 95% of the coronavirus cases wouldn't be here today. They weren't. They were negligent. They were trying to cover it up. They were trying to silence doctors. And as I told you earlier this morning, Alan, on your radio show, that there was a report that was out on the internet, suddenly pulled off all the official sites, that was by the South China University of Technology, that suggested that this virus emanated from a laboratory. People are trying to poo-poo that idea, but there was a university in China that said it from the get-go. What did they do? We do not know. It needs to be investigated.
Absolutely.